so I think we're ready to get started tonight. I am pleased to introduce, first of all, the DEQ Assistant Secretary of the Environment. Sheila Holman is here tonight, and I want to introduce her specifically. Sheila. Thank you, Julie. Good evening, everyone. Thank y'all for coming out tonight. I'm going to keep my remarks very short, and so we can get to the presentation and get y'all updated on the work that our team at DEQ has been doing since we last had a community meeting. But I do want to mention that just last week, our department, along with DHHS and Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, attended EPA's PFAS Summit in DC, and wanted to let y'all know that one of EPA's objectives is to develop what they're calling a national PFAS strategy later this year. And they want to come and meet with community members who have been affected by perfluorinated compounds in their neighborhoods. North Carolina is going to be hosting that community meeting. It'll probably be somewhere in the area here near the plant. And that community meeting will have EPA representatives here to listen to you and hear from your concerns about all that you've been dealing with. That meeting will be held probably in late July or early August, and as soon as we have the dates nailed down, we'll be sharing that information and getting it posted on the website. I want to say to y'all that we remain committed to working through these issues and getting the communities cleaned up and addressing the issues that are near and dear to you as you've been most affected by this situation. So thank you for coming tonight, and we'll be looking forward to your comments and questions later this evening. Julie? Thank you. And now I'd like to introduce our first speaker of the evening, our first presentation, and that's the Division of the Director of Water Resources, Linda Culpepper. Linda.
Thank you, Julie. I appreciate you letting us come in and talk with you tonight, and I hope that we have a good chance this evening to go back as well. If you have specific questions regarding water resources or water quality, love to talk to you one-on-one. I think that's been one of the best parts of the public meetings that we've had before, is just to be able to work with individuals. A lot of people have different issues that are happening, and we'd love to work with you one-on-one. So we have a couple of staff here with us as well tonight that can help with that. So thank you. Thank you for inviting us into your community. Division of Water Resources, and wanted to say that we're continuing to do our composite sampling at the Chemours facility. We had originally, when we started back in June of last year, we were taking samples during the week, and it was grab samples. We would just go out and take a sample. Staff are much smarter than I am, and they instituted a composite sampler where it takes a little bit of the wastewater at the Chemours facility throughout the day. It puts it into a well, and then we're sampling on Mondays and Thursdays. So it gets an idea of what's happening at the facility 24/7. So it's not just production hours and getting that grab sample, it's a composite. So we're seeing what's happening throughout the whole work cycle. And that's been extremely beneficial to us, because when we see something happening, now we can go back and say, what happened at this time frame? That there's been a spike in the levels or something, that we can understand if it happened over the weekend or during the evening hours. We're getting a much better representation of what is going into the wastewater and out to the Cape Fear River. We're also still testing the drinking water facilities once a week, and you can see them listed as well, just to make sure we understand what's happening at the drinking water facilities. Those levels have been fairly steady lately, and I'll show you some graphs in just a few minutes, but they've been below the health goal, the provisional health goal for GenX. And the third bullet there, the ambient monitoring. We're looking across the state. What are the levels in water systems? And we do ambient monitoring anyway. We're looking at nutrients, we're looking at dissolved oxygen, and so now we've added a component to where we're looking at these fluorinated compounds as well. And we started looking at Jordan Lake, because one of the researchers at Duke University, Dr. Heather Stapleton, She had looked at some water quality and drinking water from the Jordan Lake Reservoir. And we've gone back and we started in January, I think it was January 2nd, and part of the lake was still frozen, and our staff's out there doing sampling. So there are dedicated folks out there trying to get information for us. We're going to look at this for a 6-month period of time to see what the levels of the fluorinated compounds are. And we're also looking at the Cape Fear reservoirs as well. We've started that sampling. And we're also looking at the Watauga and the New River in the western part of the state. This is not an issue just for here in eastern North Carolina. We're trying to look and benchmark across the whole state as well. So here's a little different diagram than I have been doing just time series diagrams in past meetings. This one I wanted to give you a flavor for some of the other compounds that we're seeing. That top one, that blue, HPFO-DA, that's the GenX, the HPFO dimer acid. And then you can see there's 4 other compounds that we're looking at. So I picked 3 dates that we are doing some more extensive analysis. EPA has done our analysis for the wastewater and these drinking water samples down in their Athens lab since mid-September, early October. And they have just gotten some new lab standards from Chemours for some other compounds, PFMOAA. I think I got that one right. I always have to work on that one. And some other compounds, the Nafion byproducts 1 and 2, and they have set up a new mass spec to do the analysis for us. We don't have the results back, but we targeted these 3 dates and and a few other dates for them to do this initial analysis. So as soon as we get those results back, we'll get that posted on our website as well. But I wanted to share with you, this is the analysis that we have so far for those dates. Back in October 30th, and then you can see in December, and then in January, there's 2 other dates as well. If we move on to the next one, at the drinking water facilities. Now just, could you go back for just a second? I want to make sure you understand the scale. This is up to like 25. I think there was the top peak on October 30th for GenX was 2,700. So the scale is at a different level than here. The top value is about 73. Okay, just so people understand that this is different scales on the. But you can see the different constituents. So we're not interested just in GenX. We are looking at all of these fluorinated compounds. So that's of interest. And this is the Pender County water treatment facility, and the next one is the North Brunswick water treatment facility. So you can see how it changes over time. When there's blanks there, that means it was below the recording level for that particular date. And where we're headed, we've been asking for resources to be able to do more monitoring and to do the analysis in-house instead of having to send the samples to EPA for analysis. And that way we can control the scheduling a little bit better. Right now it takes about 5 weeks to get the results back from the EPA lab in Athens, Georgia. And we'd rather have a quicker turnaround time. We've also seen some of the reporting levels are higher than what we are getting from some of the private labs, and we're hopeful if we get our own equipment, we can bring those down so we can see at lower concentrations. So quicker turnaround, lower concentrations, and then we'll have more flexibility. We're competing with other states for the EPA lab resources. They're supporting states that are worried about the POFA and firefighting foam, and they have other projects going on with the fluorinated compounds. So I call it air traffic control. We're having to fit our samples into scheduling down at the Athens lab. They've been extremely gracious to us, but at the same time, we're ready to be able to do our own analysis. The ambient monitoring, I was just indicating there with the other states. One of the things that I was just sharing with someone earlier tonight, the researchers are still trying to, as they say, harmonize the test methods. So you may see test results coming from a university or a researcher, and they're still at the stage right now where we're using a drinking water test method to analyze the wastewater and the rainwater and others. So they need to come up with good test methods for the wastewater on its own. If you've got drinking water, you can imagine is a cleaner sample than something that's wastewater related. And so they're still under development. This is still part of the research. And so we're very supportive. We need that kind of capabilities for to have standardized test methods. So when we analyze something and the result is 10, and somebody else analyzes it and the result is 15, that you know you're getting apples to apples kind of comparison instead of having disparate types of test methods. So that's one area of focus. We're also looking at the bioaccumulation factor and aquatic toxicity, and Michael Scott, with Division Waste Management Director, is going to talk to you a little bit about the fish tissue studies. But to set standards, we need that information. We need information about health impacts. In some of these compounds, we just don't have a lot of health information right now. But we need those health impacts. We need standardized test methods to be able to work with and set up regulatory levels for what is safe in the water systems. So those are the things that we're focusing on. And right now, we are working with the Secretary of DHHS and DEQ Science Advisory Board to help us discern what are the appropriate health levels and to help prioritize the chemicals, because there are a variety of them. I think that's it. Yep. We want to wait for questions at the end, Julie? Okay. So I've introduced Director of the Division of Waste Management, Michael Scott.
Thank you, Linda. Good evening, everyone. As Linda said, my name is Michael Scott. I'm the Director of the Division of Waste Management. I work with Julie in that particular division within the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality. Our particular division has been focused on the groundwater aspects related to these perfluorinated compounds. As Linda talked about GenX, before GenX was the PFOA. Our focus has been on the groundwater aspects, the impacts to private wells in the surrounding communities here in Robeson, Bladen, and Cumberland counties. I'd like to thank you for coming out this evening, and also thank you for letting us, a lot of you in the room, letting us access your property to collect data, to sample your private well, to determine the true extent of this particular contamination that we're dealing with. Mike, next slide. As this particular slide shows, we've tried to update at each meeting. The tan-colored polygon in the center is the Fayetteville Works facility. A lot of you may know it fairly well. About a 2,000-acre property. Just to the right of it, a little bit hard to see, but is the Cape Fear River, where these compounds have been discharged and where the initial information related to GenX originated from. Once we started looking at the particular compound GenX and its presence in the Cape Fear River, we immediately knew that we needed to look at the groundwater under the Fayetteville Works plant, under that tan-colored polygon. Was this compound not only in the Cape Fear River, but was it also present in groundwater? So in August of last year, we split, the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality split samples with Chemours to test their groundwater for GenX. Unfortunately, we found elevated levels of that compound, up to 61,000 parts per trillion under the plant's property, and we then knew we needed to look broader. We needed to look north into Cumberland County. We needed to look in Bladen County where the plant exists, and per Director Smith, additional counties needed to be proactive and look at their own sources of groundwater for these particular compounds. Currently, we're out to 5.5 miles from the edge of the plant. Mike Abrazinskis will talk to us a little bit later this evening about some of the air quality data that it gives you some basis for that contamination showing up in groundwater at that distance. But the well sampling continues, the private well sampling continues. And you see to the west, sampling is about 3 miles from the plant boundary, to the southwest 5 miles, and due east, private well sampling continues around 3.5 miles from the Fayetteville Works facility. The provisional health goal is 140 parts per trillion. This is nanograms per liter, but PPT is what we'll talk about this evening, parts per trillion. Dr. Moore will talk about that from the Department of Health and Human Services. And the red polygons are people's properties. And the red areas show you properties that are at or above that 140 part per trillion level. The yellow parcels show you where we've identified this GenX compound in private well water, but it's not above that particular provisional health goal. And the green properties, fortunately, are those properties that have no detection, no presence of this compound whatsoever. So we are still rapidly trying to connect the dots. Why are some wells contaminated? Why are other wells not contaminated? And we're still trying to determine the true nature and extent, meaning how far out are private wells impacted. The take-home message is that you're at or above that 140 parts per trillion level. It is recommended that you use bottled water that's provided by Chemours or the 3-gallon container for your drinking water and cooking purposes. And Zach will talk to us a little more about that this evening. Next slide, Mike. So this gives you a blown up illustration, if you couldn't see before, of some of the orientation of the particular groundwater contamination. Just remembering those red polygons are the ones that is recommended that that private well water not be consumed for ingestion purposes. The yellow polygons, once again, where this compound is present, and the green polygons, luckily those properties where this particular compound, GenX, is not found. So once again, we're testing out to 5.5 miles. The Department of Environmental Quality continues to test private wells. Chemours is the responsible party. They have an environmental consulting firm by the name of Parsons. They are doing the majority of the private well testing. I would ask you to let them test your well if they contact you, and we are working behind them, trying to substantiate their data, looking at where the data makes no sense. We're taking additional samples as the state. And we've done quite a bit of private well sampling. We've sampled over 100 wells as DEQ. Next slide, Mike. Robeson County, I'll be happy to let Director Smith chime in here. Him and his staff have done a lot of work directly in this county, knowing that North Carolina 20 leads directly to St. Paul's and an additional county that may have the presence of these compounds. And after Robeson County started their own private well initiative, this wasn't Chemours, it wasn't the state, it was Robeson County, they tested upwards of 40 wells on the dates that are listed there in the second bullet. Thus far, one well, private well, that was used for drinking water purposes, unfortunately in Robeson County was above that 140 part per trillion level where it suggested that that water not be used for ingestion purposes. There were also 35 wells where that compound, GenX, was detected. Not at a level that's necessarily considered problematic, but it was still detected. 4 private wells were non-detect. The compound was not present at all. 29 of the wells had the older compounds. GenX replaced a 8-carbon compound, PFAS, and 29 of the wells in Robeson County had that particular compound in them. 27 had an additional older 8-carbon compound that GenX replaced, and 6 wells were non-detect for either of those older, or what some call the legacy perfluorinated compounds. We're actively looking at one well with Robeson County Health Department. I believe it's already been resampled, where the EPA has the 70 nanograms per liter of parts per trillion level. It was an exceedance for the older, or what some people call the 8-carbon or legacy compounds. That well has been resampled. We have not seen these other compounds above a level that's problematic in any of the private well data. So I don't want to confuse you this evening, but we're talking primarily about GenX. Linda spoke with us about additional compounds that the communities have asked us to look at, but we're also evaluating compounds that were utilized in the past and may be prevalent or present in our environment. And so there's one well that we're following up on. And 4 wells were non-detect for all of the perfluorinated compounds, or that acronym, perfluoroalkyl substances that you hear a lot about, PFAS. You hear that quite often. They were non-detect for all of those. What I would want you to understand from this slide is that we appreciate Robeson County's involvement, the data they have provided, looking at the environment in this county for the particular presence of these compounds. Unfortunately, we do have them present in this county, and more data collection is going to need to occur here at Robeson County. Next slide, Mike. This is our summary slide. As I've mentioned to you, private well testing is occurring out to 5.5 miles from the plant. There have been just at 1,000 private wells tested Some people have more than one well on their property, but the total number of wells sampled is now around 1,000, which is a huge amount to start with. The number of those wells is about 225 where people are on bottled water, or it's suggested that they not consume the water because it's at or above that 140 part per trillion level for GenX. There's 230 wells where the GenX compound's not detected at all, and 538 compounds where GenX is present, but it's not at a level where it's suggested that people switch to bottled water. The highest level of GenX that we have still detected is at the 4,000 range. And remember, the provisional health goal is 140, next level. So where do we go from here? People talk with me, I call people, trying to check in on them, how's it going? I know I talk to Fran quite often, or as often as we can get together. You know, people are tired of camping, that's the term. Being on bottled water is like camping, right? So we're trying to find that interim step, and something we're looking at, you'll hear people talk about GAC. We have to be careful of acronyms because we use them every day. But GAC is granular activated carbon. If you look at those two large canisters in the back, those blue tall canisters, those are filled with the activated carbon material that we're testing along with Chemours, testing their effectiveness in filtering out these compounds. And what I would want you to know is we're not just looking at GenX, and you as the community members have been adamant. When you tell us there's other things that are present, why aren't you testing for them? Why aren't you determining if they can be filtered out? And we are. We're asking for over 30 different compounds to be tested for when we test the water coming out of these systems. So Chemours has submitted a proposal to install these systems for folks that are at or above that 140 parts per trillion level. We've said we needed to collect more data to determine their effectiveness, and we plan on sharing that data with you guys online or email it to you. We want everyone to have availability to that data at 6 different residences to determine their effectiveness. The sampling has already started. The final system, it's a little shed with this system that goes inside of it, was installed on April the 20th. This is not an under the sink system. It filters all the water coming into your home straight from the well. So if it's in your shower, in your kitchen, it's filtering everything that goes into your house. And we've got 2 results thus far, and I will say that the results are encouraging, that this activated carbon can filter out these different perfluorinated compounds. Once again, not just GenX, but over 30 different compounds that we're testing for. I will also tell you, we don't have enough data yet. We're not going to make a final decision without sharing that data openly with the community, letting you weigh in on it, letting you provide us input, but trying to shift from people on bottled water to an interim step before we look at really the total solution, which in a lot of instances is permanent water lines. We did send Chemours a letter last Friday. They have been in discussions with Bladen and Cumberland County. We've asked them to submit a formalized plan on permanent water lines and send that back to the department within 30 days. So this is an interim step, trying to get people off of bottled water that have been impacted by these compounds as we work on permanent solutions to include water lines. Does everyone want a water line? Possibly not, but we still want to evaluate these systems as we work towards permanent solutions also. Next slide, Mike. So what else is also going on? As we work on groundwater, we're trying to make sure, first off, that you as citizens are not exposed to these compounds at levels that are problematic, that would impact you. We're also working at on-site remediation. We're trying to reduce the infiltration, there's that acronym again, perfluoroalkyl substances, these compounds from infiltrating into groundwater that can then flow into the river or potentially impact off-site wells. So Chemours has already started remediation at the Fayetteville Works plant. They have excavated contaminated soil where a couple of different spills occurred. We're waiting on confirmatory samples to confirm that that cleanup has been successful. They're also starting to remove groundwater. As I mentioned to you, from the data last August, the groundwater right under the plant is contaminated. It could continue to impact the river. It has the potential to impact private wells that are close by to the plant. So we've also been focused on remedying or fixing the solution at the plant. So that groundwater is being removed, a limited amount of volume thus far, the 6,500 gallons, but that work is underway to get that contaminated water out of the perched aquifer, the groundwater closest to the soil surface. There's also work underway at the plant regarding cleaning of equipment. You may have read in the media, there's been some different releases of these compounds to the environment, coated some of the equipment at the plant. So cleaning, decontamination of that equipment, confirming that it is clean and that stormwater will not impact or flow off of that equipment and impact the river or groundwater, those samples are also underway. Mike. Thank you. The other area of focus regarding on-site remediation is also the cooling water channel, a particular area at the plant where particular excavation and lining of that particular channel is being evaluated as far as the specific design and construction options. This is a cooling channel that water flows through. We don't want any contaminants from this channel entering the groundwater, impacting the river, or moving off site, so that design and construction options are being reviewed. We're also evaluating, along with Chemours, a couple of sediment basins that are utilized on site. They naturally contain a high volume of water. We don't want that water entering the groundwater and continuing to possibly impact the perched aquifer. So design of a remedy for that is currently under review. And also looking at the old outfall, the old discharge area at the plant. What options need to be considered between lining or piping that outfall so that environmental impacts from that area do not occur. So in summary, we're sharing with you our immediate focus is that we make sure anyone on private well water is not drinking a source that has levels of these contaminants in them above the provisional health goal that I've mentioned, but also that we're quickly working to remedy the on-site environmental releases at the plant to make sure that continued environmental impacts do not occur. Mike. So as I've mentioned, in summary here, bottled water is being provided to those at or above the provisional health goal, and Dr. Moore is going to talk to us more about that in the next upcoming presentation after air quality. And we'll continue to evaluate these activated carbon systems, and we'll be sharing that data with you so you can look at it, determine the effectiveness of it for yourself. And that there's also resampling that's underway by Chemours. So if you had your well tested and you're asking the question, I was below that 140 provisional health goal, but I was at 130 parts per trillion, could the level in my private well water change? Chemours has started retesting wells to make sure there's not fluctuations of these particular compounds in well water. Mike. And another follow-up area we've been working on has been fish tissue testing. When we first came out to talk with the communities about the presence of these compounds and the necessary next steps, we heard concerns with hunting white-tailed deer, consuming venison, eating the fish from the river, or fish from some of the recreational ponds in the area. So our Department of Environmental Quality, went out to a lake just north of the Chemours plant. We sampled several fish species. We sampled several surface water locations. We also sampled sediment at this particular pond. We were able to get some largemouth bass fish species and some red ear sunfish species on that particular day. And then in a follow-up attempt, catfish were obtained. And catfish are important because if you fish, you know they're bottom feeders, they're down near the sediment, they're at the bottom of the water column, and we wanted that additional data. And we also sampled a private well while we're at that particular site. We're using a modified EPA 537 laboratory method and running that full analytical suite. We're not just looking for the old C8 compounds, we're not just looking for GenX. We're analyzing for over 30 different compounds to make sure we know what may be present in this fish tissue. And so the surface water is also being tested for a variety of different analytes. We have some of the partial data in hand. We're missing a few pieces of it before we share it more broadly, but we hope this is an area where we can definitely say we've heard the concerns from the community. Where else are these compounds besides in my well water? Are they present in fish that I may be consuming? And we hope to have that data very, very soon. We're waiting on a couple of final pieces of it to be able to share it more openly regarding the particular presence of these compounds. All right, Mike. So with that, thank you again for coming out tonight. I'm going to transition to Mike Abrazinskis, the Director of the Division of Air Quality, to provide his overview before we conclude with Zach Moore from the Department of Health and Human Services. Thank you again. Mike.
Thanks, Michael, and good evening, everyone. I'm Mike Abrazinskis. I'm the Director for the Division of Air Quality within the Department of Environmental Quality. Thank you all for coming out tonight and your engagement on this issue. You've heard a little bit about surface water. You've heard a lot about groundwater. And so one of the big questions early on in our investigation, especially when it came to the groundwater issues that were a good distance removed from the facility, 3+ miles in some cases, was how did it get there? And so an early hypothesis or thought of ours was it was related to the air emissions drifting downwind and depositing and then washing with rainwater into the column and into groundwater. And so that investigation started with a simple question, and that was, how much are they emitting in terms of these GenX compounds into the air? And late last year, all we had in terms of information were estimates from the facility. Estimates on the order of 66 pounds per year of the GenX compounds. Those estimates were based on computational models run by the facility, but no direct measurements of emissions. So as we talked with the company, certainly we were motivated to get something more than estimates. We wanted measurements. The problem with the GenX compounds and many of these emerging compounds that we're talking about in the PFAS family, there's not an off-the-shelf stack test method available for these types of compounds that you simply stick in the stack and measure those compounds with. And so it took months of work with the company, with their stack testing consultant, and the United States Environmental Protection Agency to develop methods just to be able to get some measurements from the stack to more accurately refine these emissions estimates. While that work was going on with method development, Chemours submitted a revised estimate of their emissions late in the fall, up them to about 594 pounds per year of the GenX compounds. And then later, once we actually got to the point beyond the method development and actually got some stack test measurements for many of the processes that result in the highest levels of GenX emissions, we were able to blend those measurements with estimates from some of the other sources that they have not been able to test to come up with a latest estimate of annual emissions of just over 2,700 pounds per year. Next slide. So we started with emissions coming from the facility, but is there a way to measure in ambient air where you live or off the property how much of these compounds are in the air? And we talked with monitoring experts for months, both in our shop and at US EPA, and there was not really an agreed upon method for sampling the GenX compounds in the air. But one thing we knew for sure, we can measure it in water. So we determined that our best way to measure the air quality impacts from the GenX emissions was to measure the rainwater downwind of the facility. And so that's what we started early this year. We started initially with 7 separate rainfall catch and analysis exercises started near the facility. Then we did some experiments going distances downwind of the facility based on simply the weather forecast. If it was going to rain and the wind was going to come from a certain direction, we made sure we got downwind of the facility to start collecting some of those samples. We even went to distances as far away as 20 miles downwind of the facility. Recently, we've gone from just those initial 7 samples to some permanent fixed sites that are near the facility that are doing weekly samples. And some of those samplers will collect data for us that's both wet and dry deposition, so that's a bit unique. But again, early on, it was really our staff's innovation before we had permanent rainwater samplers in hand that came up with the samplers you see on the right side of the screen there. Those are high-density polyethylene plastic 5-gallon buckets, which just happens to be the same material that you insert into an official rain sampler to collect wet deposition data. So appreciate the staff's innovation for the early work. And so we'll share some of those results with you. This was one of our first missions back in January, where we did near-field rainwater collection. Again, the Chemours facility obviously right there in the center of the screen. And you see some varied data. Early on during this rain event, the wind was blowing from the south and south-southeast, which would explain some of the values of GenX that we see to the northwest of the facility. There's a 39.4, an 11.3, a 5.2 in those upper 3 yellow circles at the top left of the screen there. Later during that event, the wind shifted and the rain continued. The wind came from the northeast the last half of the rain event, and so it blew the emissions from the facility back toward the southwest, which helps support the 630 part per trillion of GenX in rainwater, which is the red circle, and the 93.2 down here at the bottom of the screen. That's 93.2 ppt, parts per trillion of GenX in rainwater from that particular event. So we believe, based on our analysis of that first event, based on the operating conditions of the facility at the time, and the meteorological analysis, it supports our findings. Next slide is another event where we did a little bit more, again, based on the forecast. We wanted to know, well, how far downwind could this be going and being deposited onto the ground and eventually possibly into the groundwater. And so here again, this is a slide similar to what Michael Scott showed earlier, where the facility's property is the shaded polygon in the middle. There are concentric circles centered on the center point of the facility at 3 miles, 5 miles, and 7 miles. And you'll see that we found in the rainwater, at least on the 5-mile ring, there's 810 parts per trillion in rainwater at 5 miles. You see values between 45 and 60 parts per trillion at 7 miles downwind of the facility. So again, it's not, these numbers do not indicate, or you can't compare these numbers to the 140 part per trillion health goal, because you're not going to consume or drink rainwater directly, but it is the only reference point that we have at this point. So we've kind of color-coded things compared to a lot of the, similar to what you've seen a lot of the other data presented tonight. Again, based on our analysis of the meteorological conditions, wind blew from the southwest for a good part of this event, and so that would move the emissions toward the northeast while it was raining. It supports the findings. We also know the operations of the facility during that time period and the emissions that were resulting. Next slide. One additional event to share here from April 3rd through the 10th, and this gets to our permanently sited rainwater samplers now that we have, which are composite weekly samples. So we're zoomed back in more near field the facility, where we have both wet and dry deposition at 2 sites, one southwest of the facility, one to the northeast of the facility, and then some single samplers, wet deposition, rainwater samplers, just to the north and just to the south-southwest. Again, these are composite week-long samples from a week's worth of rain. Again, all indicating some GenX compounds in the rainwater, and in the two there shaded in red, 168 and 176 parts per trillion in rainwater. So in kind of summarizing some of the facts as we know them at this point, we know that the measured air emissions of GenX compounds are significantly higher than was previously understood and reported. We know that we've measured GenX in rainwater through atmospheric deposition processes as far as 20 miles from the facility. And the evidence of the atmospheric deposition of the GenX compounds shows a pattern that's similar to some of the groundwater contamination Michael Scott showed earlier. Those footprints align pretty nicely. And because GenX is not a naturally occurring compound, and there are not other producers or users of GenX in North Carolina, in this particular area, the data demonstrates that the groundwater violations are being caused, in part, if not wholly, by the air emissions of GenX. Next slide, please. So with that information in mind, on April 6th, our division took an action, and we sent Chemours a 60-day notice of our intent to modify their air quality permit. And in that notice, we put in a requirement that they demonstrate to us by April 27th, or submit a demonstration to us by April 27th, that the emissions of GenX compounds do not or will not cause or contribute to violations of groundwater rules. Again, this was all part of our investigation to gather the necessary science and data that's necessary to inform. We have compiled all the science and data that was needed to inform this action, and what we've requested in the demonstration will help support any final action. So next slide, on April 9th, we also amended a complaint in Bladen County Court, and a motion for preliminary injunctive relief against Chemours. This action aims to require Chemours to control air emissions, remove and treat all other sources of GenX compounds, and provide a full accounting of all the processed wastewater being discharged at a ditch at the site. This was an expansion and an amendment of an earlier complaint filed in Bladen County Court back in September. Next slide, please. So on April 27th, Chemours responded to our 60-day notice. And in that demonstration, they committed to installing and operating carbon absorbers on a portion of the emissions profile of the facility. And I'm happy to report those carbon absorbers are installed and operating as of last week. Those are expected to reduce the emissions profile at the facility of the GenX compounds by about 40%. So we've taken a positive step here. There's an additional step forthcoming, at least in Chemours' response to us, and that was a note that they would commit to upgrade scrubbers at the facility by October of this year. And once that project is complete, it could reduce the emissions profile of the GenX compounds by up to 70% at the facility. There's an additional commitment in the response, and that is to install and operate a thermal oxidizer by the end of 2019, early 2020. And at that point, once that is installed and operating, it will reduce the GenX compounds at the facility by 99%. So, as far as summarizing where we are at in terms of our division's evaluation of that submittal, it was a significant submittal. We've had some questions back and forth with the facility regarding their submittal. We're continuing to evaluate it. We're evaluating the technologies, the timelines proposed, and the ultimate impacts for the offsite groundwater contamination and violations. And obviously the control device installation and control efficiencies all also being reviewed by our staff. That's all from the Division of Air Quality this evening in terms of a prepared presentation. I look forward to the question and answer session later. And now I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Zach Moore with the Department of Health and Human Services.
Thank you. Thank you all again for coming out tonight. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the health-related concerns and what we know, and I don't think it'll come as any surprise that there's more that we don't know about health effects of this group of chemicals than that we do, which is hugely frustrating to us, and you can only imagine for people who are having to make decisions about themselves and about their loved ones, it's even more critical and frustrating that there's so much that's unknown. But there are some things that we know. I'm going to talk to you about it, and then I'll try to make it quick because we really want to hear from you. It's really important for us. You know, there's so many different possible issues that could come up, so we really need to know what your concerns are so that we can make sure we're addressing them. So I'll try to be quick. Could we go to the next slide, please? So GenX is a chemical that's in this group. You've heard it mentioned already. PFAS is the short name for them. There are actually thousands of chemicals in that group of PFAS. The ones that we know more about are not GenX, but some of these older ones that are called legacy, or they go by different names, and that includes things like PFOA and PFOS or C8 that you might have heard about. They're a little bit better studied. So we know from those that some studies, oh, whoa, I'm done. I went faster than I thought. Yeah, right there, that's good. Some studies, but not all studies, have shown the effects, health effects for some of these chemicals that are listed here. So that's that they can have effects on growth and behavior. They can interfere with certain hormones in the body. They can increase your cholesterol levels. They can have effects on the immune system, and they can increase the risk of certain types of cancers. So those are, again, some of the health effects that are known for these older ones. But that bottom bullet's really important in that different chemicals in this group, different PFAS, can have very different effects. So they, one might be completely different than another in terms of the type of effect it might have. Next slide, please. Okay, so when we start talking about GenX in particular, and really not just GenX, but some of these other things that you're hearing a lot about, like the Nafion byproducts, those newer ones, there are no human data available for any of those. For GenX, we do have some animal studies, laboratory animals. That's how we get a lot of our data about toxicology and effects of chemicals, is by testing them on laboratory animals. And for GenX, fortunately, we do have some laboratory animal studies, and those show that GenX can have negative effects on the liver and the blood in those laboratory animals, rats and mice. It has also been linked to cancers of the liver, pancreas, and testicles in some of those laboratory animals. So we do know that. For some of these other ones that I mentioned, the Nafion byproducts, there's, like GenX, no human data, but there's also no animal data. So we're really in the dark in terms of health effects for some of these others. Next slide, please. So our role is to try to determine whether the compounds that are being found in your well water or in municipal water or air or wherever could pose a risk to human health, and if possible, to try to give some context, provide some health-based levels or guidance for those contaminants. And then we do what are called risk assessments. So when you, and that's along with DEQ, when you get your water tested, you get some information back, and we help consult on what to do with that information, how to understand it. Next slide, please. Okay, so when this first came to light in June of last year, sort of really coming up on a year now, we did a rapid review of everything that was available. We did a lot of phone calls. In fact, we still do a lot of phone calls with EPA, with CDC, with other groups, trying to gather as much information, make sure that we're, benefiting from everybody's knowledge. And we calculated this provisional drinking water health goal that you've heard about of 140 parts per trillion, and I'll talk to you in just a second about what that number means. And we also looked to see if we had any other data that might help us find any health effects. One thing we did have was we have a central cancer registry in North Carolina, so we did an analysis to look at the counties that are affected by this and see how their cancer rates compare to the state. And there wasn't really any trend in that. I have that report. We have to answer questions about it. It's actually posted online too. But that's some of the early things we did. Next slide. So I did want to talk to you about the provisional drinking water health goal, because I think there's a lot of confusion about what that number is and isn't, which is understandable. So what it is the level of GenX in drinking water, specifically in drinking water, below which no adverse health effects would be expected, even over a lifetime of consumption. So it's not like a bright line between a safe level and a dangerous level, where if you drink it over 140, something bad's going to happen to you right then and there. It's looking over a lifetime of exposure at the level below which we wouldn't expect any health effects. And it's based on animal studies, and there's a whole science in how you get these things, and we can talk about that too. We also have a team here who will be out at the table afterwards who can answer your more specific questions if you have them. It is based on the most vulnerable population for drinking water. It happens that bottle-fed infants drink more water per their body weight than anybody else, so they're considered the most vulnerable. So it's calculated for them, so it should be protected for everybody in the population. We get a lot of questions about that. There's also some assumptions built in there, such as we assume in this calculation that actually 80% of your GenX exposure could come from, not from your drinking water, could come from somewhere else, because we know with some of these older ones like PFOA and PFOS, you get exposed to them in other ways other than through drinking water. So we assume that even though we don't know exactly how else people are getting exposed, that only 20% is coming from drinking water. It's not a regulatory level, it's not enforceable, and it is provisional, meaning that it will change as new information becomes available. And I'll talk to you in just a second about some anticipated changes we have to that provisional health goal that could be coming up in the next month. Next slide. So I think I've already mentioned this, but in order to have a health goal, you have to have some data, some starting point, some animal studies particularly, which we did have for GenX, which is how we were able to do this. For some of these other things, like the Nafion byproducts, we don't have that. In fact, we understand from EPA they just last week started animal studies for Nafion byproduct 2, which is great, but that still puts us way, way, way back in terms of being able to come up with a level like this. So for some of those other ones, we will not, we can't come up with a health goal until we have that. Next slide. So what does it mean for you, the provisional drinking water health goal? Michael Scott already mentioned this, but what it means is that if you're above that level, if your drinking water is above that level, then we recommend using well water for drinking, cooking, and preparing baby formula. You can continue to use your well water for bathing, for washing dishes, and for laundry. CDC has, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, have done work on this, and in the general family of PFAS, not a lot of it gets in through your skin, so that's why the recommendation is focused on what you're drinking and taking in. Next slide. Okay, so talking about what we're doing now, we're continuing to review all the new testing results that you've seen here today, everything that comes from the folks in the doing the surface water testing, the groundwater testing, the air testing, working with them to review everything that's coming out. You heard about the Secretary's Science Advisory Board, or SAB. That's a group of independent experts, scientists from universities and from EPA and other places who've been pulled together, and they're helping us. They're looking at our health goal, and we're in the process right now. In fact, we have a meeting coming up next month with them where they may be making some tweaks to the health goal. So it's possible that we could be getting some refinement of that coming up in the near future. And we're also continuing to work with CDC, with EPA, with the National Institute for Environmental Health Sciences. The EPA, you just heard from Sheila Holman that they're very actively working on this, and they have indicated that they're going to have some kind of a health level coming out in the next few months also. And we've been talking with them regularly, making sure that the way we're doing it and the way they're doing it are lining up. Next slide. We're also monitoring the results of studies of blood and urine. I'm not sure if you all are aware, but there's some researchers who got funding to test people's blood and urine in the Wilmington area for some of these chemicals. And so we're working with them as they start to get their results to help interpret and understand what those mean. They're actively trying to be able to do something similar around the Fayetteville Works plant. That has not happened yet, but they're starting to work on that, which is going to be a challenge because there are no levels. It's not like when you get your cholesterol checked or your blood sugar where you know what's high and what's low. There's not really any values to compare to, but it's important to start that process. So we're working with them on that, and then we're trying to help understand the community's needs, and which is why it's so helpful to hear from you, and I look forward to hearing from you so that we can make sure that we're we're hearing your concerns and we're trying to address them. So I think that's all I have. You know, in summary, I think that the health goal is a hard concept. I think the word goal doesn't help because, you know, this is a man-made chemical. We know it's in a family that has the potential to do bad things. I think everyone agrees the goal should be 0. So goal is probably not the best term because the health goal is really just a level below which we don't expect health problems based on the data. But I'll be happy to try to answer questions that might come up around that afterwards. And I believe that's my last slide. Yep. So at this point, I guess I'll turn it back to Julie.
Thank you very much. All right, so that concludes the presentation. So we're going to switch now to the question and answer.